Hi everyone, this is Jenny from the Narrate team. In the third part of Narrate's series, Hello, my name is Anxiety, Josh shares on social anxiety and looks to two individuals in the Bible whose identity affected their security and social anxiety.
Sure is good to see all of you. For those of you who are guests with us, welcome to Narrate. We recognize that coming to a church for the first time isn't necessarily an easy thing to do, and so it's our honor and our thrill to have you. And also it's our hope that you feel welcomed. My name is Josh, and I get to serve around here mostly with our middle school and high school students and the teams that lead those students. And for the past few weeks, we've been having this conversation titled, Hello, my name is Anxiety. And our lead pastor, Adam, the last time he talked about it, he left us off with this tension between healthy thinking and toxic thinking. And toxic thinking is whenever you wake up in the morning, do you think about the things that you cannot control and the things that haven't worked out for you, the things that haven't gone well? Or you could wake up in the morning and think healthy thoughts, which is, think about the things that you can control and the things that have worked well for you. And so there's a component of gratitude there. And then also, what if there's a God who loves us and is worthy of our trust, who is in control? Today, we're going to continue the anxiety conversation, but more in terms of social anxiety. And I can't think of a moment in my life in where my own social anxiety became more clear than whenever I was teaching English in South Korea. And I really try hard to not talk about it very much. I moved there and taught for a couple of years. I try not to talk about it much now because I don't want to be that in Korea kind of guy. But so I know with some of you, maybe I do talk about it too much, but just bear with me. So anyway, moved to Korea, taught English. And one of the main things that you notice quickly is that, there's a major language barrier. I went from being one who was engulfed in English my entire life, going through grade school, going through college, a degree that had several literature classes, to all of a sudden not being able to read. And so there's this major language barrier that existed. And so because of that, especially those first 6 months as I was learning and taking classes, I was just fumbling continually with the language barrier. I mean, it just felt hard for my Korean teacher to be giving me kindergarten books. And I'm like, dog, like that. And so because of this insecurity in the Korean language, I decided to compensate by exercising my English dominance in my classroom. And I had a wide array of students, anywhere from first grade to seniors in high school, but the majority of them were in fourth to sixth grade. And so here I am expressing to them how dominant I am over them in English. They're 10 years old. This is their second language. I'm an adult. It was extremely unhealthy, but fun, and I'll explain to you why. We had this exercise called dictation. And dictation was whenever they would listen to a track of an individual or a few people having a conversation in English, and then they would have to write down what they heard. And we had a little dictation workbook, and it'd be okay, we're doing dictation 5-3 today. And it was really helpful to them. It made them listen and accurately write down words instead of just listen to, write down words that weren't accurate to what they were hearing, and helped with vocabulary retention. So I did it a couple of times a week in my class for half of a class period. And to make it fun, I made it a competition. Who could fill it out as accurately and as quickly as possible could win a piece of candy. And it would take them, 2 or 3 times of going through the track before they would complete their dictation. But the kicker is, for kicks and giggles, sometimes I would throw my name in the hat and be filling out the dictation as well. And of course, it only took me one time. And whenever I would fill it out and finish, I would just walk up into the middle of the classroom and just start gloating about how amazing I was at English. These are 10-year-olds, I'm a big NBA fan. And in 2007, 2008, the Boston Celtics beat the Los Angeles Lakers in the NBA Finals series in 6 games. And Kevin Garnett, a player for the Boston Celtics, future Hall of Famer, he was interviewed. This was his first championship for him to win. They interviewed him after that game 6, after they had won 4 games out of 7 in that series. And they asked him, what does it feel like to finally be an NBA champion? And he just shouted out, like he laid back and just like, anything is possible. And so what I would do in this dictation exercise is I would beat my students in filling out the dictation and then run up into the middle of the classroom like, anything is possible. Despite the fact that it was like a Goliath versus David kind of situation. So, with that said, I really enjoyed teaching, and I worked hard to ensure that my students were advancing in their English skills, and then also that it was fun for them. Maybe that wasn't fun, I don't know. But it was something that they didn't mind returning to, enjoyed returning to another class period over English. And then, so I think that, along with the fact that the school was going through some transitions at the time, my boss approached me several months into my tenure there and asked, hey, I'd like to promote you, and you could be like more of an administrator, manager of a team of teachers. And you would still teach some classes, but probably cut your class load in half. And I agreed to that. Now in hindsight, it's probably like, Josh is damaging the confidence of our students, so let's get him out of the classroom. But anyway, I agreed to it. And part of that job role was to hire new teachers. We had several teachers, and so it was my job to search for and hire a new one. And these are people from English-speaking countries, U.S., Canada, Australia, South Africa, the U.K., New Zealand, and so on. And I would send out application or advertisements about job openings whenever we had one, just online, and would usually receive several applications and kind of filter through those and then choose some people to interview. And I remember just going through that standard practice at one point and interviewing several people via Skype. That's how we did most of our interviews. And then we also interviewed another guy who lived in the city already that our school was in. And he just physically came into our school, and myself and my boss interviewed him. And this guy, he had a lot going for him. He was Ivy League educated. He went to Columbia in New York. So he had that going for him. And then on top of that, he was 4 or 5 years older than me. And so at that point in your career, that much experience and knowledge is helpful. And then as well, he had been teaching in Korea already for 3.5 years. Myself, I had not even been there a year yet. And then adding to that, is there a little bit of feedback going on right now? Am I just crazy? Okay, I'm crazy. Adding to that, we walked him around the school a little bit and introduced him to some teachers, and he really connected with them almost immediately. Introduced him to a few of the students. He really connected with them as well. And what I found myself doing during that interview is like, this guy is obviously in many ways a shoo-in, but gosh, he's got a lot going for him. And I felt almost threatened by the guy because I didn't have the education that he had, and I had the experience that he had, and also I didn't find myself to be nearly as likable as this guy was. And so my boss asked me, after all of those interviews, he asked, who do you want to hire? And I was completely honest with him. I said, obviously this Tony person, as was his name, is most qualified. But frankly, I'm threatened by this guy. And I don't know if I can handle him being on our staff. And my boss said, well, I tell you what. You make the decision. The ball is in your court. But just to give you one little bit of direction, I think you should hire Tony. And he didn't finish it with I think you should hire Tony. No matter what happens, I'm going to support you. Just, I think you should hire Tony. And so I went home that night and thought about all of the people that we had interviewed. And the problem was I was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because all of the other candidates, I wasn't super enthused about them. The only one that I felt was fully qualified, fully capable was this guy named Tony, but I didn't want to hire him because I felt threatened by him. Woke up the next morning, put on my big boy pants and said, grow up, offer this guy a job. I remember going on a run. Like, I clearly remember this, going on a run that morning and running much faster and harder than I normally do because I was filled with this angst. And I was nervous about what were going to be the consequences of offering this person named Tony a teaching job at our school. Called him that afternoon, said, the job is yours if you want it. He accepted it. And then 2 weeks later, he started up. And I remember during that interview process being filled with an anxiety because I was continually in a low self-view for myself, comparing myself to him who seemed to have it all together. And then during those 2 weeks of waiting for him to show up, anxious about what was going to happen. And then him getting onto staff. And I tried really hard. This is severely unfortunate and wrong of me. Most of our teachers, or all of our teachers, I tried really hard to support them in that first month because that's whenever there's so much transition going on. So it's just perpetually checking in. How you doing? What do you need? With him, granted, he had been in Korea, so he didn't have to deal with culture shock. And then in addition to that, he had been teaching English to Koreans for some time now, so there was less support that was needed there. But I treated him more with an aloof approach, like, wasn't necessarily rude, but also wasn't friendly. And then after a few months of him being on our teaching staff, I found myself thinking, why were you that way? How petty of you, Josh, to be comparing yourself to him in the interview process, in the hiring process, in the first month of him being on staff at our school. How immature of you to be continually comparing yourself to him, and in that allowing dread to set in and conjuring up scenarios in my mind that never came true, that never came to fruition. That's a social anxiety that I had to deal with, and it was in the workplace. And I think there are many of us that have to deal with social anxieties in the workplace, but it also happens in personal life too, right? There are certain circumstances that we all have to face. Sometimes it's a social setting in which there's a large group of people. And if you're anything like me, small talk is not your strength. I feel like I miserably fell at it. I never know what to talk about. It's like, the sun still exists. That's nice, right, guys? And seriously, like I went to go get a haircut on Thursday, and I remember walking to the barber, a circumstance in which there was small talk and filled with a bit of dread. Getting a haircut, For some, that's a hard social situation to be in. For others, the idea of interacting with one person or just a group of a few and having to be vulnerable in that situation is difficult, and it causes social anxiety. For some, it's difficult to have that hard conversation with somebody, despite the fact that it needs to be done, whether it's with someone in your workplace or loved ones, someone in your personal life. That hard conversation needs to be had, but it fills you with some form of a social anxiety. That's really unfortunate because the effects of social anxiety are it debilitates you in the moment, right? If you're in that large group setting, if you're anything like me, I feel like it's a significant percentage of the time, I just kind of shut down. I can't handle that large group setting. Or if you're in that more intimate, vulnerable circumstance, you aren't being, because of social anxiety, as vulnerable as you could be, and therefore you're not being able to reap the benefits of the connection that could happen between you and that group of people. Or that hard conversation, because anxiety sets in and has such a significant effect, it disallows you to be transparent about what you're feeling, and in that, the conversation is not as fruitful as it could be, or perhaps you even get walked over in that tough conversation. And even sometimes people experience social anxiety to such a significant level that they avoid one or all of those situations altogether, just completely avoid them. And that's severely unfortunate because a fulfilled relational life requires that we engage all of those listed situations at least from time to time. Social anxiety can be very debilitating and destructive and inhibitive to living a relationally fulfilled life. And so I got a question for you. We're going to share a couple of stories in the text about how it seemed like there's an insecurity that's rooted in social anxiety. But how has insecurity, whether yours or another's, someone whom you have to interact with often, that you share life with, affected you and your relationships? One of those stories in the Bible is about two kings. You can go to that next slide. One of them, his name is David. David was going to be the second king of Israel, and he was gaining a great deal of credibility before becoming the king of Israel, and things were going really well for him. And his predecessor, his name was Saul. Saul started off really, really well. But the end of his reign as king, what was chaotic and tragic, and really he fell apart, and he was filled with envy and jealousy and even murderous rage toward David and some others. So let's just go and look in the text for a little bit. It starts off with Saul making a series of really bad decisions, and then his spiritual mentor really calling him out. It says this: because you, that's Saul, have rejected the word of the Lord. You've made these bad decisions as a leader. He has rejected you as king. And later on, we see David, the one who is going to take the baton from him. David become anointed. So he, that's Samuel, sent for him, David, and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Saul becomes jealous because David is starting to gain credibility with the people that he has been leading for all this time. And it says this: the next day an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. And Saul had a spear in his hand, and in anger he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaigns. And everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. David was so successful that it started this festering jealousy in Saul. And that's to the point to where he, in anger, attempted to murder David. It gets even worse. He starts to premeditate plans of how he can murder David. It says this: Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, who was Saul's son and David's friend. And he said to him, you son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse, that's David, to your own shame, and to the shame of the mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him out to me, for he must die. Saul gets to the point of meditating on a means of murdering David and a means of getting control of the chaotic circumstances that he was a part of. And even in this, you see that he's concerned about what people are going to think of his family. He even says to Jonathan, you realize that if David becomes the king, then you're not going to be the king. And that's going to eliminate our family line from royalty. He's concerned about what people are going to think of them. David responds in a different way whenever he has an opportunity to kill Saul. I mean, this is raw stuff. This is a Dora the Explorer. This is some pretty gnarly stuff. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were laying around him. And Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, don't destroy him. David gives up control of the situation. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. This becomes true later on in a battle. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. And Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through." Or these uncircumcised fellows. It's always so weird to read that word in a public setting. "Fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. And then later on, David is anointed king of Judah and eventually all of Israel. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. What led Saul to this series of bad decisions, to this being enslaved to what people thought of him, to this chaotic, raging, murderous jealousy? What led him to be that way? There's some indications earlier in the book of 1 Samuel that show some roots of this starting up in Saul. One of those is, first off, we see Saul get chosen, and it seems like he has things going for him. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. And Samuel starts to share with Saul, "You're going to be the first king of Israel." Saul responds with this, "But am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me?" You see a low self-view taking root in Saul. And then continuing on, he becomes anointed. Then Samuel took a flask of olive oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, "Has not the Lord anointed you?" Samuel attempting to validate Saul. "Has not the Lord chosen you to be ruler over his inheritance?" During his inauguration, really. It says this, when Samuel had all Israel come forward by tribes, the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. Then he brought forward the tribe of Benjamin, clan by clan, and Matri's clan was taken. And finally Saul, son of Kish, was taken. But when they looked for him, he was not to be found. So they inquired further of the Lord, "Has the man come here yet?" And the Lord said, "Yes, he has hidden himself." He was afraid among the supplies. Now, reasonably, he's about to be the king of a nation. Everyone would be a little bit scared. But he was afraid, so he hid himself. And so they ran and brought him out. And as he stood among the people, he was a head taller than any of them. Samuel said to all the people, again attempting to validate him, "Do you see the man the Lord has chosen? God has chosen him. There is no one like him among the people." But that low self-view began to grow and grow in Saul, eventually to the point to where he was so enslaved to what people thought of him, enslaved to people-pleasing, that he started to make a series of bad decisions. And we see it whenever he said to Samuel, "I have sinned because of all these bad decisions. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord." But Samuel said to him, "I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel." As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you." And Saul replied, "I have sinned." And again, you see his need for people-pleasing going on here. "But please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God." It seems like what was rooted, you can go to that next slide. It seems like what was rooted in Saul's chaotic, bitter, rage, murderous jealousy, it seems like it was rooted in a low self-view. And you can go to that next slide, Mark. Thank you. It was rooted in a low self-view, which led to him being enslaved to being to people's approval, and therefore people pleasing. And then that led to him making bad decisions as a leader, and those bad decisions were his downfall. And his downfall involved this chaotic, jealous transition between him and David. How did identity affect Saul's security? You can go to that next slide, and social anxiety. his identity and his low self-view seemed to be catastrophic to the success of his life. Dr. Henry Cloud, a very well-known psychiatrist, in his book, The Power of the Other, which talks about people's influence on your life. I've been reading it over the past couple of weeks, and I found myself, of course we all know that people have influence on us, but I found myself just like, wow, like several times throughout reading the book. And I found also myself having simultaneously opposing thoughts. And one of them was, no wonder why I'm okay, because I've had some good influences in my life. But at the same time, I was thinking, no wonder why I'm completely jacked up, because I've had some bad influences in my life. He really communicates well on just how significant an influence people have on you. And then he says that therefore, because people have such an influence on you, you should embrace the relationships that are helpful. And then those relationships that aren't helpful, don't embrace them, and maybe even sometimes let them completely dissolve. And in that, you can grow to be a better person because of the good influences in your life. But please, and he argues this, don't become consumed by you're not good enough, that you need to please people. He says at one point in the book, when alarm bells in your head start ringing, you're not good enough. When fear of disapproval, of displeasing someone, or of falling short of some metric of goodness, you can go to the next slide, starts driving your actions, you know you're running out of fuel. Is this not what happened to Saul? He had lost control because he had become enslaved to what people thought of him. And in that social situation of him being the leader of Israel, and during that transition between him and David, it was complete chaos. There's another story in the Bible that involves Jesus and his kingdom. A woman approached him, a woman who, unlike Saul, had nothing. And she had the audacity, the bravery to approach Jesus and ask for help, ask for validation. It goes, the story starts off with Jesus being invited to dinner. It says, when one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And a woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. And then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. And when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. And neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house, and you did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Saul, at the start, he had a lot going for him. He came from an established family, was an attractive, likable person. And unlike Saul, this woman, she had nothing. She had no wealth, no possessions, no respect, no status, probably not a family. And if she did have a family, that family was likely severely broken. She had nothing. But yet she had the audacity to approach Jesus And the crazy thing is she was the epitome of unlikable in this culture. She not only was at nothing because of, having nothing, but also she was negative in her likability budget because of the occupation that she had. Scholars say she was a prostitute. She was in the negative. And then for her to approach a man named Jesus in front of a group of religious leaders who were also very likely men, at least Simon was, for her to do such a thing whenever it was her occupation to be used by men, what kind of courage would it take for her to overcome such fear, to approach Jesus and ask Jesus for help and express her love for him? It seems like this woman, unlike Saul, understood that there were certain truths about her. Despite the fact of her status, despite the fact of her occupation, there were certain truths about her that no one could take away. For one, she was created in the image of God. You can go to that next slide. She was created in the image of God. And then also, just as King David had once wrote in a song, I praise you, God, because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. This woman understood this about herself, it seems. And then on top of that, too, she must have been in agreement with Paul whenever Paul wrote to Timothy, the young leader. For the spirit God gave us is not a spirit that is timid, not a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and love and self-discipline. So what if we, as we approach social situations, whether it's a large group, whether it's going to require a significant amount of vulnerability, if it's going to be that hard conversation that you've been putting off for months, maybe even years, what if we, in approaching these social situations that can cause anxiety in us and can be debilitating, or even can be so severe that we just avoid them altogether, what if we approach these social situations with the same understanding that we, just like this woman, have certain truths about us that no one can take away, that we are valued by God, and therefore should be valued by people as well? What if we started to embrace the more noble parts of us instead of continually, if you're anything like me, I look through my journal sometimes, and it's just like, here's all the broken things about me that I'm trying to fix, and just get over all of the broken things about you and think about some of the good things about you sometimes. As it says in Philippians 4, Verse 8, a verse that we've been talking a great deal about during this series. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true about you, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable or likable would be another way of putting that. If anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. What if we started to embrace the positive, the healthy truths about who we are? Whether that's a universal truth that all of us have because we are all made in the image of God, or whether that's something that God has gifted to us as individuals. You have that family, you have that job that you enjoy, you have that set of friends, and it's something that you had to work hard on, yes, and it's also something that God gifted you with, but regardless, it is a positive truth about who you are. So what if you this week wrote down 5 positive truths about who you are? You can go to that next slide. 5 positive truths about who you are. And if you're in a situation like this woman and you find yourself, I don't have much, remember that there are certain parts of you that have been a part of you since you were born and will always be a part of you, and no one can take them away. You are fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image. And God has given you a spirit of love, of power, and of self-control. It's my hope that we Narrate, as we take on social situations, regardless of what they might be, that we would trust in this identity that we have in God, that he has given us, and this identity that we have worked hard to obtain. The ways in which we have done well. The positive truths. Let's pray. God, thanks so much that we have an identity in you. And so regardless of where we are at in our lives, we can always trust that we were made in your image, that we were wonderfully made, and that, God, you want to give us a spirit of power, of love, and of self-control. And so, God, as we approach social situations, whatever they might be, it might be something on the daily where you have to interact with a coworker or meet a group of people in a meeting or be vulnerable with someone whom you've needed to be vulnerable with for a while, or maybe have that hard conversation that's been put off for some time. I pray, God, that we would trust that we have an identity in you that no one can take from us. God, we love you. We thank you for your mercy and your forgiveness. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.